Hit record. Hey, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Austin from the School of Cities, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session of Knowledge Cafe, featuring Elise Como. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The land on which the University of Toronto operates is the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and continues to be the gathering place of many Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples from across Turtle Island. As we consider the push for equity and justice in the lands we occupy, it is also important to remember the long-standing and ongoing repercussions of the colonial histories of these lands and their enduring effects to this day. Since not all of us are joining from the same location, I encourage you to consider these factors within and around your own living environment. Knowledge Cafe is brought to you by the School of Cities, the University of Toronto's multidisciplinary center for urban research, education, and engagement, dedicated to discovering new ways for cities and their residents to thrive. Knowledge Cafe at School of Cities is a monthly speaking opportunity for members of the tri-campus community at U of T to present insights and highlights of their research on a theme that is important and relevant to urban environments. It provides a platform for faculty, students, and researchers who are working to uncover solutions for creating more just, sustainable, and prosperous cities. Today's Knowledge Cafe features Elise Como, who will be discussing her research on accessible taxi services for drivers and disabled riders in Toronto. Elise is a bilingual urban planner and third-year PhD candidate in planning. Her doctoral research focuses on the intersection of transportation, planning, and accessibility, with a particular focus on disability. She works as a research affiliate in the Engagement and Planning for Inclusive Communities Lab at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. Elise's previous professional experience includes working as an urban planner for a Toronto-based land use planning consultancy. Before we begin, I'd like to just cover a few housekeeping rules. As a reminder, today's session will be recorded. We ask all attendees to keep their mics on mute for the duration of the presentation. We also ask you to put any questions you may have in the chat throughout the presentation. They'll be collected and addressed at the end of the session. And finally, please practice good etiquette. People demonstrating inappropriate language or behavior will be removed from the session. And thank you. Without any further ado, I'd like to hand today's session over to Elise.
Thanks very much, Austin. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, is everything good? You see the presenter screen? Awesome. It's an honor to be here today to present my work on accessible taxis. And this work was focused specifically on disabled people and taxi drivers here in Toronto. And again, thank you all for tuning in during your lunch breaks. As Austin mentioned, my research overall is focused on equitable transportation planning and accessibility. And this is a topic that's arguably been overlooked in both planning education and professional practice. And it's what motivated me to undertake this type of work. This specific research was only possible with the teamwork from my co-authors, Drs. Timothy Ross, Siobhan Kelly, and Dr. Yanni Hamdani. So this research was undertaken through the EPIC lab at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. And this specific paper and study is part of a larger study on accessible taxis in Toronto. And our partnership also includes Checker Taxi, which is a fully accessible taxi brokerage serving residents within Toronto. And finally, the work was funded by a SSHRC Partnership Engage grant. So today's presentation will have 4 parts. I'm first going to contextualize the work and provide an overview of the research context and why it matters. After that, I'll present the research design. I'll then move on to our findings, and I'll wrap up with some recommendations for us to consider as a group. So first, with the research context. So why am I here today discussing accessible taxis? To frame the work, it's super important to underline the ongoing issue of inaccessible public transit in our province. You might have noticed an increase in news reports on the topic of inaccessibility. especially in the past year, because we're approaching the AODA's 2025 deadline for creating an accessible Ontario. And the AODA, for those who aren't familiar with the term, stands for Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So the headlines we see on the screen here are all from the past year, and they're specifically focused on Ontario. It's important to mention that this past September, the TTC staff admitted that 13 out of 70 of the subway stations won't be finished with elevator construction by the AODA deadline. So this includes popular downtown stations like King, Spadina, Museum, Christie, College are on the list, as well as High Park and others. When considering a big city like Toronto, it's also a rapidly aging city. So it's no surprise that the likelihood of having a disability grows exponentially as our population ages. In Toronto specifically, approximately 500,000 seniors live in the city, and in less than 20 years, that population is set to nearly double. So missing this AODA deadline on Canada's largest transit network will continue to impact disabled and senior Torontonians' ability to get around the city. That being said, the TTC has been making a lot of strides when it comes to accessibility, but there's more to be done. So in Canada, to contextualize it on a larger scale, 27% of adults report living with a disability. 1 in 5 Canadians with a mobility disability report being housebound due to the unavailability of specialized transportation. And this could be accessible buses, vans, taxis, and other types of paratransit. The TTC provides specialized transportation services through Wheel-Trans. When travel demand exceeds the capacity of its transit fleets, Wheel-Trans will contract out subsidized trips to accessible taxi brokerage as part of their service design. So this is where this research comes into play, because the accessible taxi brokerage that we were working with was basically brought in by Wheel-Trans to fill in a gap in their service. And the data set for this study was provided entirely by Checker Taxi, and they are an accessible taxi brokerage. They're fully accessible since the 90s, and they accommodate Toronto residents using mobility devices. The rides are booked through the Wheel-Trans platform, and it costs the same fare as any other trip on the TTC. So it's just like any other form of transit. Before we move forward to the research design itself, it's important to unpack the very complex history on training for taxi drivers in Toronto. So this is just a glimpse. There's more to it, but I thought it would be helpful to contextualize what's going into the training in order to understand the experiences that taxi drivers and passengers are experiencing. So back in 2014, the City of Toronto launched a comprehensive 17-day training for all taxi drivers. And this training was informed by best practices, including simulations, modules on ambulatory care, equipment knowledge, and passenger assistance. And then within that same year, in September of 2014, UberX launched in Toronto and Mississauga. And this service allowed non-professional drivers to shuttle passengers in their own personal cars. And then with the approach of the 2015 Pan Am Games hosted by Toronto, one could assume that this robust city-run comprehensive taxi driver training was established to ensure that accessible taxi cabs would be available ahead of the games. Now, moving on to 2016, so to level the playing field as Uber disrupted the taxi industry, Toronto City Council removed all training requirements for taxi drivers and private transportation companies such as Uber and Lyft. And this removal include, of course, the removal of the comprehensive training course for taxi drivers. This decision resulted from years of contentious debates around how to accommodate Uber's ride-hailing service alongside existing traditional taxi operations. So it was a very heated topic around this time. And then fast forward to 2018, the driver training was reinstated a year later, but in 2018, there was a fatal crash involving an Uber driver who pleaded guilty to careless driving. And this is thought as the catalyst that encouraged the city to reinstate driver training for all taxi drivers. So the current state of training today is that all taxi and Uber drivers are to complete a less rigorous training program, and it's been privatized. So the city has a series of organizations that they approve to provide this training, third-party organizations around the city. In the case of Checker Taxi, they administer this training in-house with their drivers, and they provide an annual refresher training session. But I do want to emphasize that the training is much more condensed, less hands-on, like basically a summarized version of what was in place prior to this. Now, moving on to our research design. On a higher level, the existing literature does identify transport-related barriers and offers insights into how people with disabilities experience different transport modes. But there's been remarkably little attention that's been given to understanding drivers' attitudes and actions towards disabled riders, and specifically how riders experience accessible taxis. So our qualitative study was guided by the two research questions you see here on the screen. First, what issues are disabled riders experiencing when using accessible taxis? And second, what are the experiences and behaviors of accessible taxi drivers? We conducted a thematic analysis of 590 customer complaint reports and 494 driver-filed incident reports, again, provided by Checker Taxi. These reports covered trips all within Toronto between 2014 and 2021. So it's a very large chunk of time, and we acknowledge that COVID, is found within that chunk of time. And so while the implications of COVID on accessible taxi services were not our focus, we do note that the data set covers a period during the pandemic. And we found that many of the same issues persisted before and during the pandemic. But we did find that some reports filed after March 2020 noted a lot of concerns around PPE use. So, not wearing masks, customers or drivers not wearing masks or wearing them below their chin or nose, and so forth. As for the theoretical perspective, it was informed by a critical disability studies perspective with a particular focus on ableism and disableism. For those who aren't familiar, ableism refers to a set of beliefs, practices, and processes that favor certain abilities and disregard those without said preferred abilities. So an example of this would be designing a station without elevators. Disableism, on the other hand, can be understood as practices that promote the unequal treatment of people based on presumed or actual disabilities. So this is more like name-calling, overt acts of discrimination. Suggesting that one cannot exist without the other, this conceptualization of ableism and disableism supports our exploration of accessible taxi service delivery and driver and rider experiences. And it helps us with questioning whether the service achieves its mandate of providing a barrier-free, accessible service. We also drew on critical ableist studies to further question and unpack the layers of ableism. Engaging with these types of perspectives allows us to unpack the design and also the operation of the service, and supports a critical understanding of driver and rider experiences. And I just want to touch a bit on crib time because it's a very interesting concept that was used throughout the data analysis. Um, and crib time, basically, it presents time in a way that considers how people with disabilities experience barriers. So this concept was originally developed by disability studies scholars, Alison Kafer and Ellen Samuels, and it has the potential to help us shift how we think about disability. It challenges what we know as clock time and the normative expectations of scheduling by proposing a reorientation to time that requires reimagining our notions of what can and should happen in time, or recognizing how expectations of how long things take are based on very particular minds and bodies. So the takeaway here is that crib time is a new orientation to time that accounts for the actual resources that disabled people may require to complete daily activities. Now moving on to our findings. So they're organized across 3 themes. And as a preface, the experiences reported in the findings are unsurprisingly quite negative, as they're coming from our data sources, which were complaints and incident reports filed by drivers and customers. So it's just a bit of a warning that they will be quite negative. So the first pertains to inconsistencies with the delivery of required services. As per Wheel-Trans policy, all drivers are trained to escort customers to and from the accessible door of the pickup or drop-off. However, a lot of customers describe trips where the driver did not provide this service. So we see this quote to the right. This comes from a customer complaint report, and it reads, "The driver pulled me up the ramp backwards. I'm using a manual wheelchair, so I was facing down the slope of the ramp. I asked in a panic, 'What are you doing? This is the wrong way to do this.' He said, 'It's easier for me this way. You don't have a belt?' I replied, 'No, I don't. I can fall out.' I had to quickly grab onto my wheels to prevent myself from falling forward. Not surprisingly, this really stressed me out." Moving on to in-vehicle device securement, so how the mobility device is strapped once it's in the accessible taxi. There were many examples in both driver filed reports and customer reports that commented on whether the driver was struggling with or failed to secure the mobility device correctly. And oftentimes, riders and their caretakers had to educate the driver on proper device securement. Sometimes drivers hadn't seen that type of wheelchair, for example, and then just didn't know how to safely secure it. And this is quite problematic because we see that the access work is being wrongfully placed on the customer and their caretaker, rather than being placed on the drivers who should be trained in, a wide variety of mobility device securement. Now on to the third point. There was also a lot of confusion around inclement weather procedures. So what to do when there's a storm. And this, again, came from both drivers and riders. So Wheel-Trans, they have a policy that directs drivers to cancel trips or decline pickups if the origins or destinations aren't safely, let's say, shoveled or de-iced, and if they don't meet accessibility and safety standards. But regardless of this policy, there were many instances where drivers arrived at a drop-off destination and the driveway wouldn't be cleared. And so this quote here is from a driver, and it states, "There was an excess amount of snow in front of the customer's house. I let them know that it is not safe and I can't be held liable to get the customer through all the snow. They gave me a shovel and told me to clear the snow." So some drivers reported clearing snow and ice themselves, despite the policy, while other drivers would not clear the snow, but would still proceed with helping the customer into the vehicle. So climbing over snowbanks or walking on icy driveways. And such scenarios often resulted, unfortunately, in both riders and drivers falling and risking injuries. So before moving to the next category, I think it's important to kind of pause on this topic of snow clearance and weather, because it prompts bigger questions about responsibility. The City of Toronto's municipal code requires property owners and tenants to remove snow and ice from all property adjacent walkways. So this could be driveway, parking, steps, sidewalks, within 12 hours of a snowfall. So while people with disabilities and seniors in Toronto have the option to apply for a free sidewalk snow removal program, it's not always, the service isn't always provided promptly, and some addresses can get missed, causing a significant barrier for people to safely exit their homes. Now, moving on to driver awareness and communication. Firstly, with regard to driver knowledge, many customers and riders noted incidents where drivers were unaware or didn't understand their abilities and needs. So the quote on the left captures this point. It notes, "The customer claims that the driver failed to assist the customer from the doors of the location. Customer claims that the driver was yelling for the customer to come over toward them. Customer is visually impaired and was unable to see where the driver was shouting from." There were also instances where customers made service requests that the drivers missed or ignored, which really demonstrates a lack of awareness on the needs of people with different abilities. Another common issue pertained to drivers' use of degrading or intimidating language. So the second quote on the right, the driver seeing that, and this comes from a customer complaint report, the driver seeing that she was physically unstable and shaky when walking on her own, told her that if she is constantly like this, that Wheel-Trans will no longer pick her up. That he did this to seniors worse because she felt intimidated by him and concerned that Wheel-Trans would cut her off because of her disability. So we can see how problematic this is. Here, the driver's commenting on a rider's slower walking speed and essentially threatening them by saying that Wheel-Trans may no longer take them on as a customer. The power embedded within ableist language is very clear here, making riders feel shameful about their mobility and physical challenges, or making them worry about being banned from using what might very well be their only transportation option. The third and final theme pertains to conflict management. There were many instances of driver assault, both verbal and physical, with little clarity provided to the driver on the appropriate protocols to follow for managing and preventing conflicts with riders. Many drivers reported incidents where customers and their caregivers threatened them. So most threats related to making a complaint against the driver and then proceeding to getting the driver fired. An excerpt from an incident report reads here on the right of the screen. The customer was insistent that the driver make a turn, which was not going toward the drop-off. The driver said he was unable to make that turn. At this point, the customer began making verbal threats to the driver. She claimed that she would ram the vehicle with her power wheelchair, use the wheelchair to run into the driver, and have the driver fired. So harassment also took the form of name calling and mocking, including racial insults. And although less prevalent than verbal abuse, there were several instances where drivers were physically assaulted by customers. So this included incidents where stones were thrown at the accessible taxi vehicle, or customers kicking the drivers while providing assistance. When drivers were subjected to such scenarios, it really heavily impacted their ability to complete their duties. Some drivers cited being distracted and losing hours from work following such incidents. As for the second subpoint within conflict management, a lot of reports commented on investigation procedures and inconsistencies. So after a complaint was filed, there would be little to no follow-up, whether it's with the driver or with the customer, on what steps were followed to alleviate the issue or to find a solution between both parties. So again, the reports noted a lot of confusion with the next steps and asking for answers. Some drivers would report abuse from repeat customers and would ask to be removed from future ride requests made by these specific customers. And then many drivers and customers who made complaints requested a comprehensive follow-up that they never received. So this quote here illustrates this issue. So I expect to hear that re-education will be part of the plan for mitigation, but find such an approach to be relatively empty gesture when there is no indication for follow-up and ongoing compliance. So this was filed by a customer. Now moving on to our recommendations. So the issues highlighted by accessible taxi riders and drivers in the study point to a critical need to improve driver training, and hopefully this is clear after hearing the findings. To support the safety and well-being of drivers and disabled riders, we make recommendations for a comprehensive driver training program. So we have, and these are based on best practices and research. We have different modules that we'll be recommending, and then we also provide some policy implications. So moving into this driver training program recommendations that we make, the first kind of umbrella module would be focused on disability awareness. And this would address our findings that touched on awareness and communication and the inappropriate language. So just increasing the knowledge of drivers on the diversity of disability and the needs of riders who use their service. And as you see on the screen here, the first would be on disability education, and we recommend facilitation be provided by both the paratransit agencies as well as disability advocacy groups. It's very important to include disabled, whether it's riders or advocacy groups, in order to share firsthand experience and be there to answer questions that drivers may have. So an example of this first facet would be an educational presentation on the different disability types and needs, different mobility devices that people use, and the types of accommodations that they expect to receive. The second part of this module would be focused on sensitivity training, and again, facilitated in partnership with disability groups or riders. And this would include simulated scenarios that mirror real life experiences. And simulations have, when they're done right, because I know there's contention around simulations that are done in poor, they're not done properly, but having them led with disability groups or advocacy groups and riders have proven to be extremely helpful for training drivers for situations that they may face while providing the service. And then just in terms of best practices, wrapping up with a group discussion. So being, open to drivers sharing their experiences and questions in a spirit of there's no wrong questions, and debriefing on experiences that drivers may have had and have questions about. And then next, we recommend a module focused on transfers and safeties. And transfers mean bringing the customer into the vehicle and then out, so onboarding and alighting or deboarding. And this would address the findings that related to drivers not knowing how to secure specific mobility devices. And it would also touch on inclement weather procedures too, what to do when there's snow, what's the most that drivers can do and where that balance is. And again, we recommend that this would be facilitated between, it would be a joint effort between the paratransit agency, disabled riders, as well as potentially occupational therapists, just to be on site to give recommendations. An example of such a exercise for this module would be professionally guided exercises with drivers using a training accessible taxi vehicle and various types and sizes of mobility devices, or disabled riders with mobility devices to engage in skills training by practicing boarding and alighting with the drivers. So it would be both parties would be receiving this training. And then lastly, a module on conflict resolution. And this is very much in place and recommended for addressing the findings related to conflict management in the customer complaint and incident reports. Key topics here would include de-escalation strategies and communication protocols. And again, a joint effort for facilitation between the transit agency, a trained instructor in conflict resolution, as well as disabled riders. And an example of this could be an exercise of de-escalation involving a simulation or role-playing with drivers led by a trained instructor. And now moving on to the last slide, which is focused on policy considerations. To preface, hopefully it's clear after hearing the issues encountered by disabled folks using transit, but access to transportation is a right, it's not a privilege, and this right isn't equally shared in our society, as our findings illustrate. So for accessibility to really be meaningful, it's important to interact and really understand the systemic barriers that people are facing every day and to remove these barriers. So our study leads to several policy considerations, and the first is directed to local governments, and it concerns the establishment of a comprehensive driver training program. This would ensure that drivers are very well educated and prepared to provide specialized services to disabled riders. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it could be similar to the one established by the city back in 2014. And this just proves that it's been done and it's possible, but we're at a point where it just relies on political will to have these strong policies in place that ensure safe training. So moving down the road would be, again, a responsibility for local governments and transit agencies to strengthen policies around inclement weather protocols and to clarify and define the responsibilities of both drivers and riders. Local governments also have a responsibility to improve their snow clearance programs. So there's a need to focus efforts to ensure that snow will be cleared or to communicate delays that are inevitably bound to happen. So to communicate these delays with residents that are part of snow clearance programs so that they could then let Wheel-Trans know that their scheduled ride shouldn't come if their property isn't safe. And now moving further down the road, again, for transit agencies to establish protocols that improve the transparency of the complaints process. This would address all the issues with conflict resolutions and really ensure that riders and drivers feel confident once they submit a complaint that there will be a follow-up. So mandatory updates should be required. And then lastly, since ableism is very much entrenched in our systems, municipal governments and paratransit agencies have a significant role to play in educating the public on disability and accessibility requirements to raise awareness about not only the diversity of disability, but also the right of all riders to a safe and dignified trip. This can go a long way in efforts to destigmatize disability. And the TTC is already doing this with some public education campaigns in their stations. And of course, at the center of all of these policy considerations is the need for meaningful engagement with disabled people and engaging with them about their trip experiences and throughout the development and implementation of policy changes or any new operational practices is paramount to ensuring that the service is positively experienced. So I leave you with a parting quote. When it comes down to it, all the accessible vehicles in the world won't make a difference without good service and positive attitudes on the part of the bus companies and drivers. And that's it. I have on the screen here 2 publications that came out of this larger accessible taxi work. Some of what I mentioned today came from this first paper that you see on top of the screen. And then the second paper is the quantitative side of things. I wasn't involved in this work, but partners in the study team were, and this covers travel patterns. It talks more about COVID. So if anyone's interested in reading these papers, I'll link them in the chat. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elise. That was a very interesting and eye-opening presentation. I think we'll open up the floor for some Q&A for the time being. I know we have a couple in the chat. So the first one from during the presentation, one person asked, is Checker the service you had talked about before for residents and / or visitors?
Checker, well, I think you have to be a resident because you sign up through Wheel-Trans. And so it's the program when you order any accessible ride, you book it through Wheel-Trans. And I do think that registration has to be done by Toronto residents. I'm unsure if Checker Taxi provides private services on the side that can be booked directly through them. I'd have to double check, but for sure, Toronto residents unsure about if it's open to people visiting.
I'd also just like to take a second to introduce Costa, also from School Cities. He's going to be tag teaming the Q&A with me today. I was going to ask one more from the chat. In your opinion, do you want to do away with the third-party driver training programs and replace these with the ones devised by local governments? What do you think is the best way to approach that?
I think having one in place ensures that that what needs to be covered is covered. The issue when this type of training gets privatized means that there's a lot of fluctuation in what the driver is actually receiving as training. And of course, we want to give benefit of the doubt to all third-party training providers, but it leaves room for questioning whether it's enough and whether the driver is receiving enough education on what they should know for accommodating disabled riders. So I personally think that having one, City of Toronto mandated city-run training program would be better. Just thinking of what was in place back in 2014, this extremely robust, like 17-day program. Of course, financial considerations come into play. That's much more expensive. But in a perfect world, I think that would be the better option.
Thanks, Elise. There's another question in the chat, which I'll just read out. And Hosung asks, are there cameras in the accessible vehicles? It seems to me that would be helpful in investigations of incidents for improvements and also for potential charges in case of assaults. So what are your thoughts about cameras in vehicles, or if you know about them being in vehicles?
I'm not sure. I think I think there are, I could be wrong, because I know that there are cameras in city buses and streetcars, and the service that is provided by accessible taxi brokerages are mirroring that of public transit. So I can't confirm or deny that there are cameras in the checker taxi vehicles, but I do think my opinion would be that this is a very important and somewhat easy thing to do, to just in terms of accountability and safety on both parties, to have those cameras in the vehicles.
Thank you for that. We also had a couple pre-submitted questions from our registrants. One of which is, are there any quick wins that Toronto could do today that would significantly improve the experience of disabled taxi riders, sorry, not drivers.
Yeah, many quick wins. Let's see. There's three that are top of mind. The first being kind of echoing, our recommended driver training program, and the first module being sensitivity and disability awareness training for drivers. That's like top of mind. If the drivers don't know what type of accommodations their riders need, then, both parties are set up for kind of failure from the get-go. So this education, and it doesn't need to be this multiple day training, but just really ensuring that the sensitivity and disability awareness education is strong and is received before drivers go out onto the road. I think that would be the first. The second quick win, I mean, quick is a great term, but I think assessing the scheduling of rides, so booking drivers between different customers. Sometimes the drivers feel very rushed, and I didn't talk about this in the findings today, but it's in the first paper from the study. A lot of drivers felt really rushed to make their second pickup, and so this often translated into them rushing customers. And when a customer has a mobility impairment, being rushed is, the last thing you want to feel when getting into the car. And so it's more of an operational fix, would be to make sure that riders are scheduled with a lot of time in between, to ensure that drivers don't feel this crunch of, oh, I need to make the next pickup, and, and then putting riders in really unfavorable situations. And then I guess the third quick win, going off of the first one of disability awareness, would just be engaging with disabled riders, like just asking them what you need, how was this experience, how can we improve our design interventions. I think this, not just for accessible taxis, but this can be applied to any design intervention in Toronto or in any city, really. Like a couple months ago, this is unrelated, but the bike lanes on Eglinton West, they were flush with the sidewalk, with very little tactile differentiation. So any blind customer or any blind pedestrian, this caused a very unsafe environment for them to be traveling, because this bike lane, which for some seemed like a good idea, but it's, you start thinking about some people in the community, this is a huge red flag, and this makes the space super unsafe. And so consultation is a word that's thrown around a lot, but it is so important for just ensuring that we're not missing these, nuances that could provide a lot of barriers for some.
Thank you again for that. We have a few more questions in the chat, but I just see that Tim has his hand up. Tim, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to chime in. Full disclosure, I'm an author on this work with Elise. But I really wanted to emphasize a point that you've already made, Elise, and that pertains to the scheduling issue. And while that might not be a quick win, I kind of view that as a really high priority because I think that if we have accessible taxi brokerages, paratransit organizations carrying or scheduling trips without adequately accounting for the temporal needs of people living with disability, the fact that their embodied experiences, they they may have different requirements. And so when you create that scheduling constraint and put that on the driver in a way, right? Drivers are trying to meet their schedules. They got to get one trip done to get to the next. And when they're feeling rushed, we're creating an opportunity for cascading negative effects. Okay, so it's actually this a really key issue at the core of a lot of other issues. And I think if we can revisit that and some of the ableism that is inherent in how we're thinking about scheduling and not accounting for those needs, we can actually work towards addressing a lot of the other issues that are occurring. So Elise, you mentioned that, but I wanted to double down because I think it's a really big point. Okay.
Thank you. And also Tim is one of my supervisors, so that's another fact.
Thank you, Elise. Great presentation.
We are unfortunately running short on time, so any questions we don't have time to, I'll be sure to forward to Elise after this session. But I see MW, you also have your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, hi, Lise. We communicated before. I'm here in my personal capacity, but I work for the Canadian Human Rights Commission. I'm presently in Ottawa. I'm disabled. I use a walker. I have a MS. And I'm interested in whether this study will expand maybe on a federal level that would come into the work I do as an equity advisor. Secondly, and I actually had never heard the term disableism. And then you distinguish that from ableism, which I had heard, but I wasn't sure if it was pejorative. So part of our work that we're training actually our incoming employees is unconscious bias, whether that's race or Indigenous affairs. So could you distinguish that? It seems like, from what I understand, that ableism is unconscious bias, systemic. So, hey, come to my bakery and your bakery has 2 stairs to get up, or more overt, what we call discrimination, say under the Canadian Human Rights or the Ontario Human Rights Act. That's it.
Great, thank you for your questions. The part one, so whether this work would be scaled up to a federal level, I mean, that would be great. It's not within the scope of the work that was encapsulated in this project, in this partnership grant. But I do think that there's so much opportunity, and Tim can chime in too if he wants to, but so much opportunity, especially approaching this 2025 AODA deadline. I have a sense that the federal government and provincial governments are going to be discussing accessibility more seriously, and that's, of course, the hope. But yeah, no current plans to scale this up on a federal level, but it would be great. As for the distinction between ableism and disableism, you're absolutely right. Ableism is more, systemic, baked into our systems, and disableism is more overt. I think it's just another word to describe what you had mentioned as just more plain discrimination. The example that we used in one of our papers was name calling as overt disableism, but it's just another word to communicate, direct discrimination. So your understanding of it was or is correct. Thank you for the questions.
Thanks, Elise. We'll wrap up with just a couple last questions from Christine Shepard that were written in the chat. So the first question is, did any of this data speak to some of the other challenges with wheel trans, such as long wait times, narrow pickup windows, which can be common challenges when using traditional wheel trans? And does the taxi option help alleviate these types of concerns in the data set?
So I'm just rereading the question one sec.
Sure. If you'd like, you can answer the second question as well. Also, do customers get a choice at all when booking Wheel-Trans, whether they can request the taxi service versus traditional Wheel-Trans?
Yeah, so from my understanding for the second question, they don't have the option to select whether it'll be through a service like Checker Taxi or Wheel-Trans. It just depends on the availability of their vehicle fleets at the given time for the scheduled pickup. And then the first part, did any of the data speak to, yeah, of course, like longer wait times, narrow pickup windows for sure. So all of the challenges that are common with Wheel-Trans, you know, they also percolate into the brokerages that are hired to provide the service. We did have a lot of reports that talked about, and this is mentioned more in the first paper that's published, but papers that discuss drivers being very late because of other scheduling issues, delays that happen before the scheduled pickup, or being late or being too early and posting a no-show or canceling on the customer because the customer wasn't ready. So this is an issue that is very, very common with accessible taxi services that are brought on by Wheel-Trans. So any issue that you would think Wheel-Trans faces, Checker Taxi or any other accessible taxi service also faces it, because it's an operational issue most of the time. So it feeds into all of the different services.
So we are unfortunately at the end of our time today. I'd just like to thank you, Elise, and to all of our attendees today. It was a really great presentation and a really great discussion. Like I said before, any questions that we didn't have time to get to, I'll forward to Elise for her to consider. School of Cities has a lot more exciting events coming up in the next couple of months. I'm just popping a link in the chat for anybody interested.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.